Earth had been beautiful once. Blue skies, green forests, cities full of life, and millions of people thriving. But all of that was gone now. A month ago, everything changed. The alien invaders, the X-Wrath, had come from the stars. Their enormous ships hovered over every major city, their weapons unmatched. In a matter of days, the world fell. Buildings crumbled. People screamed in terror. The planet's defenses, helpless against the invaders' technology, couldn't even slow the onslaught. Earth's leaders tried to fight back, but nothing worked. It was only a matter of time before the last remnants of humanity would be wiped out. In the midst of all this destruction, a young alien girl, Lyra, had been stranded. She had not arrived with the invaders. She was a scout, sent to gather information about Earth's environment before the full invasion. But something went wrong. The attack was brutal, and Lyra's ship was damaged during the battle. Alone, without any way to communicate with her people, she had watched as the X-Wrath took control of the planet. The destruction was complete, and most of the Earth's inhabitants were either dead or had fled to underground shelters. The Earth that Lyra had once thought of as a paradise was now a graveyard. The world was silent, save for the occasional distant rumble of explosions or the screams of survivors hiding in the shadows. But Lyra, with her strange blend of alien abilities and her determination to survive, had endured. For weeks, she roamed the ruins of cities and fields, evading both the terrifying monsters that had emerged in the wake of the apocalypse and the X-Wrath's patrols. She had learned to blend in, to move silently, and to hide in plain sight. Her alien senses allowed her to detect the faintest of movements, giving her the edge against the beasts that roamed the planet now. But everything changed the day she found him. She had been scouring a once bustling city center, now reduced to rubble, when she saw the human. A man, barely clinging to life, lying unconscious under the wreckage of a fallen building. The scene was familiar to her. Humans were often found like this now, broken and abandoned, left to die in the streets. But this man, despite his injuries, was alive. For the first time in weeks, Lyra felt something stir in her chest. A sense of purpose, perhaps. Humans were weak compared to her people, their bodies fragile, but their minds. Lyra had always been fascinated by them. They fought, they survived, and they refused to give up, even in the face of death. Lyra approached cautiously, her heart pounding. She had not interacted with any humans since the invasion, but something about this man drew her in. She knelt beside him, her alien eyes scanning him for signs of life. Her fingers brushed against his chest, searching for a heartbeat. It was weak, but it was there. In that moment, Lyra made a decision. She would save him. Lyra's hands trembled slightly as she gently lifted the rubble off the unconscious man. He was human, fragile, but somehow resilient. Her alien instincts told her that she should leave him. After all, humans were not her responsibility. She was alone on this strange planet, and the last thing she needed was to get attached to a dying species. Yet, as she looked down at him, something deep inside her refused to listen to that voice. She couldn't explain it. Perhaps it was the way his chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, or the vulnerability in his features. She had seen countless bodies on this dead world, but this human was different. His life was hanging by a thread, and yet he fought to cling to it. Lyra's heart, which had grown cold in the wake of the X-Wrath invasion, began to stir with an unfamiliar emotion. Compassion. The world outside was silent, the remnants of a once thriving civilization now quiet. The streets had been abandoned for weeks, and there was no one else here to help him. If Lyra didn't act, the man would surely die. She had seen it happen to countless others. Survivors were rare now, and only the strongest could survive in this harsh new world. But something about this man made her want to try. With a sigh, Lyra knelt beside him and carefully began to assess his injuries. There were deep gashes on his arms and legs, cuts that looked like they might have been caused by the falling debris. His clothes were torn, and his face was bruised, but he was alive. Barely. The sight of him in such a state stirred a sense of urgency in Lyra. She had to do something. Lyra knew she had the power to help him. As an alien from a distant star, her body was far more durable than that of a human. She had been trained in various forms of healing, though, to be honest, she hadn't expected to ever use them on a human. But in this desperate moment, she didn't care. She would try. She placed her hands on his wounds, channeling her healing energy into him. Her skin glowed faintly as she concentrated, her alien abilities activating. It was a strange sensation, using her power to heal a human, but Lyra was determined. She could feel the damage inside him, the way his body fought to hold on. It wasn't easy. Humans weren't as resilient as the species she knew, but she could feel the steady pulse of his heartbeat beneath her fingers, encouraging her to keep going. Minutes passed like hours as Lyra worked, her focus unwavering. She could feel the energy leaving her body, but she ignored it. If she stopped now, this human, this stranger, would die. She wouldn't let that happen. Not on her watch. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the man's breathing became steadier, his pulse stronger. Lyra leaned back, exhausted but satisfied. He was alive. He was breathing, and his body was beginning to heal. For the first time since the invasion, Lyra felt a glimmer of hope. She had saved him, and in doing so, she had also saved a piece of herself. The road ahead would be difficult, and the world was a far different place than it had once been. But for now, all that mattered was that the man was alive. And Lyra had made the first step toward a new purpose in this broken world. The man's eyes fluttered open slowly, his vision blurred by pain and exhaustion. His head throbbed, and every muscle in his body felt like it had been stretched beyond its limit. He groaned softly, trying to move, but his body felt too heavy. The last thing he remembered was the explosion, then nothing. His eyes focused on the figure kneeling beside him. She was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her skin had a faint otherworldly glow, and her features were sharp, almost alien. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, her deep eyes studying him with a mix of curiosity and something else. For a moment, he froze. Panic surged through him. Was she one of the creatures who had caused all this destruction? Had they found him? But no. There was something about her that made him pause. She wasn't attacking him. She wasn't like the beasts he had fought to survive against. She wasn't like anything he had encountered before. Lyra watched the man as his eyes adjusted, watching him carefully to see if he was conscious enough to understand her. He was disoriented, and she could see the fear in his eyes. "Don't be afraid," she said in a soft, steady voice, her accent strange but soothing. "You are safe now." The man blinked at her in confusion. He couldn't form words at first. His mind was too foggy. She wasn't human. He knew that. But then again, nothing on this planet was normal anymore. Was she an ally, or was she going to hurt him? The thought made him swallow hard. "You saved me," he managed to rasp, his throat dry. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in days. Lyra nodded, her eyes flickering with a strange emotion he couldn't place. "Yes, I healed your wounds. You were dying." He tried to sit up but winced at the pain that shot through his body. His injuries were still fresh, and the effects of the explosion had left him weak. She reached out a hand, steadying him with surprising gentleness. He took it instinctively, noticing how strong and firm her grip was, as if she could have lifted him without effort. He studied her closely, now fully aware of the strange, almost unnatural aura she had. She wasn't like the survivors he had met before, survivalists, scavengers, hardened by the apocalypse. No, she had an aura of something more. She was calm in the midst of the chaos, like she belonged to a different world entirely. "You're not from here," he said, more to himself than to her. Lyra nodded again, her eyes distant. "No, I am not from this world. I am from the stars." The words hung in the air between them, and the man found himself staring at her, not knowing how to respond. How could someone from the stars be here, on a ruined planet full of monsters and chaos? What happened? He asked, his voice now stronger. Why? Why am I still alive? You survived because I chose to save you, Lyra replied, her voice soft yet firm. I am alone on this planet too. I had no reason to keep you alive except I needed to. I couldn't just leave you. Her words lingered, and the man blinked, unsure of what to make of them. But one thing was clear. She was different, and somehow she had chosen to keep him alive when everyone else in this wasteland had failed. As he looked into her eyes, something shifted in him. Maybe this woman, this alien, was the key to survival. And perhaps, just maybe, they were both stuck here, together, for a reason. The man slowly stood up, feeling the strain in his muscles, but managing to push through the pain. Lyra remained by his side, her watchful eyes never leaving him. He could sense her alertness, the way her body was always ready to react, as though she was prepared for anything. It was a strange comfort, knowing she had his back, even though he had no idea who, or what, she really was. Where are we? He asked, his voice hoarse but clear now. What happened to the world? Lyra hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she looked out over the ruined landscape. The sky was a dull, sickly color, and the horizon was filled with the skeletal remains of cities and forests, burned and crumbled into dust. Nothing grew here anymore. The planet was dying, and the remnants of humanity were barely holding on. We're on Earth, Lyra said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness. But it is not the same Earth that you remember. Something happened, something that destroyed everything. He looked around again, as if expecting the landscape to change, but it remained the same, dead, barren, and unforgiving. Monsters, he muttered. The creatures that attacked. They weren't human. What are they? Lyra's gaze hardened, her lips curling into a subtle, grim line. The monsters are the result of the disaster. Some were once human, mutated by the radiation and the chaos that followed. Others are things from beyond this world. I don't know the full story. But they hunt, they kill, and they leave nothing behind. His mind was racing. Earth, his Earth, had been destroyed. He had only been trying to survive, but the thought of monsters like that was overwhelming. His thoughts turned to his family, to the people he had lost. But there was no time for grief. Not now. They had to survive. We need to find shelter, the man said, his voice steadying. If you save me, we need to make sure we stay alive. Together. Lyra nodded, a strange understanding passing between them. They were in this together now, for better or worse. He didn't know much about her, and she knew nothing about him. But survival had a way of bonding people, and in this ruined world, he knew he had to trust her. Lyra began to lead the way through the ruins, her movements fluid and graceful. She had an unnatural confidence, as if she was used to navigating through danger, and her eyes darted around constantly, scanning for any signs of movement. The man followed her, feeling a strange sense of security in her presence, even though everything around them was terrifying. We can't stay here for long, Lyra said as they passed through the remains of a collapsed building. The monsters, they know when humans are near. They'll come looking. He nodded, understanding the urgency in her voice. As much as he wanted to ask her about her past, her species, he knew that now wasn't the time. They needed to stay one step ahead of the horrors that roamed the planet. Do you know where we can go? He asked, his voice quieter now. A safe place. Lyra's expression softened, and she glanced back at him. There is a place, she said, far from here, but it's dangerous. We'll need to be careful. Together, they continued their journey, their footsteps the only sound in the eerie silence of the ruined world. They were two survivors in a planet that had lost everything, but in each other, they found something worth fighting for. Whether it was survival, companionship, or something more. Neither of them knew yet. But they would find out. Together. The air was thick with dust. The ground beneath their feet cracked and dry. The sun, if it could still be called that, hung low in the sky, casting long, twisted shadows over the decaying landscape. The man and Lyra moved cautiously, their eyes constantly scanning for danger. The city ruins stretched out before them, buildings like jagged teeth sticking out of the earth, and an unsettling silence seemed to press in from every direction. Lyra led the way with confidence, her movements swift and sure. The man could barely keep up, his legs still sore from the battle earlier. He had no idea how she managed to navigate this wasteland with such ease, but it was clear that she had been here before. Her steps were light, and every so often she would pause, her senses alert, scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. "How long have you been surviving like this?" the man asked, his voice quiet, but tinged with curiosity. "How long have you been alone?" Lyra didn't answer immediately, and for a moment he wondered if she had even heard him. She was lost in thought, her sharp eyes searching the distance. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and distant, as though the words were difficult to say. "It's been years," she said. "I was sent here on a mission, but the world changed before I could leave. I don't know what happened. One moment, everything was normal. The next, the earth was dying." The man glanced at her, a pang of sympathy piercing his chest. He could only imagine how difficult it must have been for her to watch everything crumble, to lose so much in a world she didn't belong to. But there was something more to her words, something in the way she spoke, the way her eyes seemed to distance themselves from the present, told him that there was more she wasn't saying. "And the monsters?" he asked, carefully watching her face. Lyra's expression hardened, and her jaw clenched. "They were not always monsters," she replied, her voice colder now. "Once they were human, but the disaster twisted them, turned them into something worse. They're not just animals. They're more than that. They remember, and they're angry." The man shivered at the thought. His mind struggled to comprehend what she meant, but he didn't press further. He knew there was no point in asking more questions. They both had their scars, their pasts, and right now, surviving was the only thing that mattered. "We need to keep moving," Lyra said abruptly, breaking the silence. "There's a safe house ahead, a place where I've hidden before. If we can make it there, we'll have a chance." The man nodded, pushing aside the discomfort of her words. He followed her without question, knowing that wherever she led him, it was their best hope for survival. They passed through crumbling streets, moving quickly and quietly. The silence was maddening, broken only by the occasional creak of metal or the distant echo of something moving in the ruins. The world felt alive with danger, a constant threat hanging over them. Suddenly, Lyra stopped, her body going rigid. The man froze beside her, his senses on high alert. He didn't need to ask what it was. The faintest rustling from the shadows told him all he needed to know. "They're coming," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. "The monsters." The man's heart raced as he scanned the ruins. He could hear them now. The low growl, the scraping of claws against stone. They were closing in. Fast. Lyra reached for the blaster at her side, her hand steady, her eyes calculating the best route of escape. "Stay close," she ordered, her voice sharp and commanding. "And keep your head down." They were about to face the monsters again. But this time, they weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting for each other. The air grew tense as the low growls of the monsters echoed around them. Lyra's eyes locked onto the shifting shadows, her senses razor-sharp. The man's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to steady his breath. He knew they didn't have much time. The monsters were close, and he could already hear their claws scraping against the ruins as they prowled through the broken streets. Lyra moved swiftly, crouching down to stay out of sight. Her body pressed close to the ground, like a predator stalking its prey. The man followed her lead, his legs shaking as he tried to match her pace. He wasn't used to this kind of survival. He wasn't made for this world of danger and constant fear. But he had no choice now. He had to stay close to her, trust her, or they would both die. Lyra gestured for him to stay quiet, her eyes narrowing as she listened for the sounds of the creatures. They were coming, and they were coming fast. The man didn't know how long they had been hiding in the ruins, crouched behind a broken wall, but it felt like hours. He could feel his body aching, but he stayed silent, his eyes scanning every movement, every shadow that moved around them. Lyra had been right. These creatures were relentless, and they never stopped hunting. Finally, Lyra motioned for him to move. She moved quickly, her steps light but purposeful, guiding him through the crumbling streets. They ducked behind pillars, ducked into ruined buildings, always staying low, never stopping for too long. The monsters were hunting them, but they weren't stupid. They had learned how to hide, how to move quickly when needed. At last, they reached the old warehouse Lyra had been aiming for. The rusted doors creaked loudly as Lyra forced them open. The man stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. It was dark, the only light coming from a small window high in the corner. Dust hung in the air, and old crates and boxes were scattered across the floor. Lyra pulled him toward the back of the warehouse, motioning for him to stay close. She whispered, "We wait here. They won't expect us to hide in plain sight." The man nodded, his heart racing, though his mind was still reeling. How did she know all of this? How did she know how to survive in a world like this? Before he could ask, the growls of the monsters grew louder. Lyra's eyes flashed with determination. "Stay silent," she whispered, her hand on the blaster at her side. "We'll make it through this." Minutes passed like hours, the sound of the monsters growing closer. The man's nerves were frayed, his body tense, ready to spring into action. He didn't know what he could do if the monsters found them, but he knew he wouldn't be able to hide forever. Then the shadows in the distance shifted. The creatures had found their trail. Lyra didn't hesitate. She pulled out a small makeshift grenade, a device she had rigged together using scraps from the ruins. "Cover your ears," she whispered. Before the man could react, Lyra threw the grenade into the center of the room. It exploded with a deafening blast, sending shockwaves through the building. Dust and debris filled the air, and the monsters let out howls of pain and confusion. The man's ears rang, and he had to blink rapidly to clear his vision. The monsters were thrown back, disoriented and confused, giving Lyra and the man a moment to escape. "Now," Lyra shouted, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the back exit. They ran faster than ever, hearts pounding in their chests. They were running for their lives, but this time, they had a plan and a glimmer of hope. Lyra and the man ran through the dark alleyways, their footsteps echoing against the broken streets. The monsters were close now, their howls louder, more desperate. The blast from the grenade had only delayed them for a moment, but that brief window of opportunity was enough to push them forward. The man could feel his legs burning with every step. His lungs ached, but he refused to stop. He had to keep up with Lyra. She was the only reason he was still alive in this nightmare of a world. She knew the land, she knew the monsters, and most importantly, she knew how to survive. Without her, he would have been just another casualty, another lost soul in this desolate place. "Lyra," he gasped between breaths, his voice desperate. "Where are we going? What's the plan?" Lyra didn't answer immediately. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, constantly on the lookout. She was the calm in the storm, the steady force in a world gone mad. But the man could see the flicker of concern in her eyes as she pushed forward. She wasn't invincible, and this was far from over. "We need to reach the old shelter," she finally said. "It's hidden deep in the ruins, but it's our best shot. We can lock ourselves inside and wait for the creatures to leave." The shelter was their only hope. It wasn't much, just a small underground bunker that Lyra had discovered long before the apocalypse. But it was safe. Or it used to be. She had been hiding in it for weeks before the man crash-landed on this planet. Now, it was the only place that could offer them even a tiny chance of survival. The monsters were relentless. They seemed to always be one step behind, never tiring, never giving up. The creatures had adapted quickly, and Lyra knew they had to get to the shelter before the monsters figured out their hiding spot. As they neared the shelter's entrance, Lyra stopped abruptly. She grabbed the man's arm and pulled him behind a pile of debris. They crouched low, holding their breath as the sound of the monster's claws scraping against the ground grew louder. The man's heart raced in his chest. He could feel the sweat running down his back. "Stay still," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're close." The monster's growls were almost deafening now. The man's mind raced. What would happen if they were discovered? He wasn't trained for this. He had no weapon, no way to defend himself. He had only Lyra's guidance, her strength, and her skill. The monsters passed them by, the ground shaking with every step they took. Lyra exhaled quietly, and the man allowed himself a brief moment of relief. But it wasn't over yet. Lyra motioned for him to follow her. With a final burst of energy, they sprinted toward the shelter. She reached the door and quickly input the code that would unlock it. It slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the dark, cool interior. They stepped inside, and the door shut behind them with a heavy thud. The man leaned against the wall, catching his breath. They were safe, at least for now. Lyra collapsed onto the floor, her eyes closing for a moment as if allowing herself to relax for the first time in hours. The man joined her, sitting beside her in the dim light. They were both exhausted, their bodies battered from the constant running, hiding, and fighting. But they had made it. For the first time since they crashed on this world, the man allowed himself a small smile. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Lyra, and they had survived together. Whatever the future held, they would face it side by side.